Hi everyone, my name is Zara and today my topic is Swedish immigration policy in the late 20th century versus today. Sweden is a Scandinavian country located right between Norway and Finland. Its capital, Stockholm, houses 1 million people, which consists of 10% of Sweden's overall population as of 2019. Before Sweden's independence, it was a place forged by Vikings and early Christians used for hunting and pillaging small towns. Going into the ninth century, the many provinces in Sweden's territory began to absorb into one single unit. Sweden gained independence as a country in 1523, followed by the formation of their constitution in 1809. Sweden wasn't always such a beautiful country. In its infancy, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway were all ruled under a single monarch from the years 1397 to 1523. The Stockholm bloodbath of 1520, in which 80 Swedish nobles were slaughtered under executive order, Gustav Vasa rebelled and seized power, which led to a new era and the independence of Sweden. 1968 was a great year in Sweden. A new political ideology began to grow into the mainstream that revolved around multiculturalism and ethnic diversification. In 1975, a unanimous Swedish parliament, led by the Social Democratic Party, voted in favor of changing their current immigration and minority policy. This granted newcomers with more rights as immigrants and refugees. Such rights included equality, freedom of cultural choice, and partnership that coincided with the standard of living for those who are native born. This would then replace the previous policy, which revolved around ethno-cultural homogeneity. At the same time, Finnish immigrants who came to Sweden to work laborious jobs were forced to move back to Finland after a stark decline in work due to the oil crisis at the time. As Finnish migrant workers began to leave, doors began to open to Islamic culture. This can be seen as a transitional period where labor immigrants were replaced with refugee immigrants. Although Islam in Sweden began in the late 60s, their prominence did not take note until the 80s. Along with Yugoslavia, many Arab countries began to take refuge in Sweden, not only from the Middle East, but from North Africa as well. I've bolded Tunisia here because it will be relevant later when we discuss the literature for this week. In 1995, the first ever meeting between Muslim youth organizations and the Foreign Ministry of Sweden was held. The conference was officially titled Islam in Europe, and the result of that meeting led to the creation of the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations. This meeting was considered a big step in integrating Swedish and Muslim culture. The results of multiculturalism by the end of the 20th century had really started to show. Approximately 300 to 350,000 Muslims were living in Sweden by the year 2000. Even more interesting, 100,000 of them were second-generation Muslims born in Sweden. Sweden in the 21st century continued to push for more multiculturalism by welcoming in more and more refugees and immigrants. Sweden had become a world-renowned country for celebrating cultural differences, encouraging cultural expression and embeddedness, and welcoming ethno-cultural diversity. In 2006, Sweden declared a year of multiculturalism, in which all state institutions and embassies showcased their multiculturalism. As wonderful as it is, there was also many complications with taking in so many asylum seekers. For demographic context, from 1900 to 2010, Sweden's population doubled from 5 million to 10 million. However, in that same time frame, foreign-born population in Sweden increased by nearly 2,000%. This caused the unforeseen refugee crisis of 2015. This year marked the end of Swedish exceptionalism. On the chart on the left, you can see a tremendous spike in refugees, up to 162,000 in 2015 alone. By November 2015, the Swedish government decided to close off almost all of their doors to new asylum seekers in fear of an overstretched welfare system or complete system collapse. As a result of the already overloaded amount of refugees, many of those who sought asylum were left to sleep outside in the cold. Swedish migration agencies struggled to find a suitable place for them to stay. The policy changes that took place were very strict and stringent compared to before. Refugees could now only receive temporary residence permits. The country's border security was also stepped up by doubling the amount of officers that patrolled the southern coast, which was a popular location where most refugees would arrive. The attitudes of Swedish citizens also changed drastically. The graph on the right was a poll that asked Swedish citizens, should Sweden let in more or fewer asylum seekers? Compared to 2015, the percentage wanting more dropped to 20%, while those who wanted fewer rose by 35%. Although multiculturalism was widely supported, it was definitely a mixed bag of emotions. A very negative outlook that began surfacing as more and more Muslims came to Sweden was Islamophobia. As early as the 1980s, xenophobic groups began targeting people with Muslim backgrounds, and even as far as blaming them for the current recession. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, but this researcher conducted a multitude of surveys to Swedish citizens to determine their attitude on Islam. There was an overwhelmingly negative view on Islam, with many responders describing them as incompatible with democracy, oppressive against women, and expansive. The researcher also claimed that the media was largely responsible for spreading these negative attitudes. Even in the late 90s and early 2000s, Otterbeck noted that the level of prejudice was and still is high. Unfortunately, hateful thoughts sometimes translated to hateful actions. In 1991, a 25-year-old Iranian student was shot in the face outside of Stockholm University. In 1993, 2 young Somali immigrants were stabbed to death outside of a local mosque. 2 repeated arson attacks were taken place in 2003 and again in 2005 on the Malmo Mosque, along with other buildings in the Islamic Center. Another mosque was a victim of an arson attack in 2014. It was struck down by Molotov cocktails and vandalized with racist graffiti. Racism and hate crimes continued to spread, as crimes motivated by Islamophobia increased by 69% from 2009 to 2013. Jonas Hassan Khamiri is a Swedish writer born in 1978 in Stockholm, Sweden. Since writing the book Invasion, Khamiri has written 4 novels, 6 plays, and many short stories and essay collections. Growing up in Sweden as a multicultural citizen, Khamiri can speak Swedish, Arabic, and French. Khamiri's mother is a Swedish native, while his father is a Tunisian immigrant. Although Khamiri described his own experience with anti-immigration and racism as relatively mute, he remembers his father explaining his side of things. Khamiri's father taught Arabic and French in high school and demonstrated to young Jonas just how differently he was treated when he would speak Swedish with an Arabic accent versus Swedish with a French accent. Khamiri wrote the short play called Invasion in 2013. The play is very controversial, using dark political humor to get its point across. Every scene in the play is elusive in nature and bluntly displays a very racist social climate. There are many examples of Islamophobia in the play. For example, one scene involved a character, Yusuf, telling a story of meeting with his uncle in New York City. When he saw his uncle for the first time there, he had markings on his forehead that said "Go home" from when he fell asleep on the train. In another example, the play utilizes narrators such as interpreters and experts to give their input on situations. The interpreter intentionally tries to misconstrue the translation of an apple picker who is speaking in Arabic about his experience. The interpreter mentions that he used to play suicide bombing with his youngest brother, even though that is not true. He goes ahead and mistranslates a slurry of other insulting and racist comments. The experts say that once Abu Qasim comes to New York, all these bad things start to happen, such as high crime rates, infectious diseases, and many more despicable falsities. I mentioned Abu Qasim in that statement, but what is Abu Qasim? The play uses this made-up word using multiple meanings. In reality, the word represents an adjective, a noun, a verb, an insult, a phrase, an expression, or anything really. It can mean absolutely anything. However, my interpretation is Abul Qasim is a word with ever-changing contexts. It's a word that can hold meaning, all the meaning in the world, or no meaning at all, just like all words. In the context of Khamiri's ultimate message, though, one Abu Qasim Arab is not all Abu Qasim Arabs. So, to conclude, I would like to ask a few critical questions. Do you believe Sweden reacted rationally when they tightened restrictions on their borders? Why or why not? And lastly, what is one thing we can do to actively stop the spread of Islamophobia across the nation? That's it for my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed and learned something very valuable today. Thank you very much.